All right. I think we should be good. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Houston React Developers Group. My name is Tracy. I'm one of the organizers for the group. I will also be facilitating tonight. And we also have Fabian, who's one of our organizers as well. And then we also have Nick on the line here. And then tonight, our presentation is hands-on accessible forms with Cam. I'm going to allow Cam to introduce himself to everyone once he gets started. Real quick, if anyone has a topic that they are interested in, or if you yourself are interested in presenting, there is a link in the YouTube description that will allow you to go to a form that you can fill out. It's only 2 questions. It's nothing crazy. What topic would you like? And are you, interested in being a presenter? And that's it. And if you are, leave your information in the form and we will definitely reach out to you. Please follow our YouTube channel, subscribe while you're on the live. That always helps us out. Please look us up on Twitter as well, Houston React Developers. We love, having more followers. And then with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take away everyone else's screen and unmute Cam and let him take over.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. My name is Cam Beaudoin. I'm a senior accessibility specialist. I also love talking about accessibility here. Tracy, just quick, looks like you may have to share my screen up here just for me to get started. But quick thumbs up here if anyone. I have the chat open here. I'd love to see where you're from today. Really glad to be here today. Someone may have to click on. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, I see it up here. If we have any issues, tech issues, just put it in the chat. I think that's really, really good. All right, so you may hear me today describe images as I practice inclusive presentations. Don't worry, I'm not going to go too much into detail. This is actually part of accessibility. It's to make sure that whatever's on screen, we describe it so that anyone may benefit from that too. So to get us kicked off, though, I want to ask. In 1945, the US Air Force was facing a really big problem. There's too many plane crashes. On screen, I've got an image of an airplane, looks worse for wear, has crashed into a yard, a field, something like that. And the Air Force didn't know why. Okay, when they built airplanes back then, they used a book that was written even 100 years prior to that to get the metrics, the stats of the human body, written in 1835 by a Belgian scientist. And that scientist, for the first time, had used data and statistics to find out what the quote unquote average man was. So they used that book, figured out what a cockpit looks like, and built around that. And the problem was pilots couldn't control their airplanes. So at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they remeasured all the men there because, of course, the Great American Physique had grown, right? Of course. And when they remeasured everyone, someone said, okay, well, hold on a second. Let's figure out how many Air Force men at this base actually fit that average, right? If you imagine a bell curve, how many men were perfectly average across all 10 metrics? And you'll be surprised to know not a single one, 0%, not a single man. There were 3,000 men who were tested out again, and not a single one measured as being average. Now, if you reduce that down to only 5 to 3 metrics, less than 5% of men also measured an average. So in effect, what they'd done is they'd built airplanes for nobody. Maybe there's a parallel here between our clients and carousels and stuff like that that we're using on websites. So after that, there was a flurry of new research, and there was a big focus on adaptability, on foot pedals and helmets and suits and seats. Everything was adjustable after that. And the amazing thing, you know what happened, was that pilot performance soared. In fact, this is how the study and the research and the body of work around ergonomics was born in the US, because there was all of a sudden a focus on adaptability instead of just average. What does this have to do with React forms? Well, if you talk to clients, right, sometimes accessibility can seem really regulatory. So I always try and address mindset first. I tell the story being a bit different. And the benefit is, of course, that you are all now airplane cockpit experts, in addition to being React developers. In this talk, I talk a little bit about statistics, not much about lawsuits. But the truth is that right now in the industry, we need more accessibility professionals. We need them like right now. We need advocates and specialists and consultants and developers and designers and testers, all of them. Everyone needs to care about accessibility. And that's kind of where I fit in a lot of. I teach people to care about people with disabilities, to think about them before they start building. Before we get into that code, I mean, like I said, I don't know who you are. I don't know your role in the organization. I don't know your experience level. Maybe you're a freelancer, but maybe you've been in this situation before where you're staring down a large table with intimidating looking executives or something like that. And what they're thinking is they're saying, don't waste time on accessibility. It's a waste of time. It's not our target market. It doesn't matter. I know I've been in that situation before. Maybe you have as well. And this could be your bosses or even your clients. Let's remove that line item. Let's not worry about the accessibility guidelines. It just doesn't matter. They think it's time consuming or useless, costs a lot of money, things like that. So I hope to show in this talk as well that it is easy. And if you think about it a little bit earlier, that you can really make a difference. Because you know what? If it ain't fun, then just don't do it. I think this is probably one of those really important slides that we don't talk enough about. Accessibility can just be so regulatory, so boring, unapproachable. Because if we get resistance in the company, maybe we just haven't approached it the right way. We're all creatures of pleasure and stories and things like that. That's why I don't really involve the accessibility guidelines in these talks anymore, because you just don't get that same kind of idea. Because we're all on this scale. On screen, I've got an image. There's a triangle with at the very bottom, the foundation, right? You need some work. And that's the bulk of, I don't know, websites out there right now. Then you kind of move off as good, better, best with smaller and smaller grades. Maybe your project is in that quote unquote needs work, right? You got that accessibility backlog that's miles long. Well, see, in our industry, we kind of have this problem where we want people to be the best all the time. Everything needs to be 100% accessible. And if you're not doing it like that, then you're wrong. Well, I have a problem with that. Accessibility is a journey. It's progressive improvements and continuous learning about how humans interact with technology. So I know for myself, I need to work on my user experience knowledge, right? Like as a generalist of technology, I don't know that much about UX. I'm getting better. It doesn't mean I'm going to go apply for a job as a UX professional, but everyone should know just a little bit more about what they currently do. Moving up this pyramid takes time. Accessibility is not a race. And many times, what we're trying to do is change a corporate culture, especially as accessibility professionals. If you're interested in accessibility, you're probably trying to do the same. You have to think of yourself as an ally. Think of yourself like a coach, right? Just like coaching someone to do better, coaching an organization to do better, coaching your team to do better, coaching yourself to do better. Just like a diet or saving money, our only tool is time. So what I really like to say and really want to emphasize here is that patience plus persistence equals progress, not perfection. But Cam, it's too tough. And I know you're thinking that. I know that's what you're thinking right now. Accessibility is complex. There's rules, there's guidelines, and it's hard to navigate that. There's too many, right? I think the last time I checked the web content accessibility guidelines was 78 success criteria. That's a lot to go through. And it's not a checklist. It's like reading the driver's handbook. It's really hard to learn how to drive through a manual. But anyway. But maybe you've heard of this little company called Microsoft. Well, they've got the Microsoft Adaptive Controller right center here. It's an Xbox controller, open source, by the way, and it's got two really large buttons on it. And this has transformed the gaming industry. We tend to think of accessibility equals blind, probably through assistive technology, such as screen readers or things like that. Well, the CEO, Satya Nadella, his son was severely disabled, just passed away recently, but he made a priority in the organization that accessibility is important. And I think we should all do the same. And they're leading the way, by the way. This gamepad for Xbox, it's like nothing else. Around the screen, there's different assistive technologies as well. There's a joystick on the bottom right. There's a sip puff device on the right side. There's a foot pedals and switches and toggles and Joy-Cons and other even Xbox controllers as well. And this is totally cool. This is really, really interesting because this controller is 100% adaptable to the user. And in fact, even the unboxing itself is accessible. What I've got on screen here is the unboxing of the device as well. It's got a large pull handle, and you know what it doesn't have? It doesn't have that flimsy plastic that you got to tear open because, man, wouldn't that be a barrier to somebody as well? On screen, I've got an image of two friends of mine who are in Montreal, and they're using tag team mode in a game. So Brad is on the left, Daniel's on the right, and Bradley is a nonverbal spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy. He cannot control the muscles in his body. So what this allows him to do is, or them to do, is they can all of a sudden play games two-player. So imagine you never being able to interact with a game before. You're only a passive participant. Then all of a sudden, Microsoft, someone online, enables accessibility, and all of a sudden you've given somebody the ability to interact with your tool, your software. What is it? This is really forward-looking, by the way. It's a really great way to bring in new clients too. Microsoft has seen that. Of course, they're after the dollar too. New gamers, new streamers. Twitch has huge libraries now of accessible gaming and accessible gamers. Excuse me, disabled gamers, and they are just rocking it right now. So in the end, really, what is accessibility? But it truly is about inclusion. It's about getting your app or your product or your software, your website usable by as many people as humanly possible. And as technical folks, we really do have an important role in the business. And this is especially true in smaller organizations. To a lot of teams, accessibility is that forgotten thing, right? I mentioned earlier that Jira board, 200-300 tickets long, right? To some people, it's ARIA tags, it's regulation, it's the web content accessibility guidelines. But to others, it's ramps on sidewalks, it's buttons to open doors, it's Siri and dynamic brightness to be able to adjust everything too. A few stats just to start off the conversation here as well. 1.3 billion persons with a disability live currently globally. In the US alone, 60 million, and that actually represents the largest minority group in the US. And 19.3% of Americans self-identify as having a disability. If you wear glasses, you actually have a disability. You're sight impaired. You just maybe not consider yourself as having a disability. But man, doesn't that help when you can increase the font size if you're short-sighted, right? And your efforts as a developer, as someone who creates products and websites and tools and technologies, is directly relatable to the success of your company. Because accessible sites sell more products, they do more, and of course, less lawsuits as a result of that too. I'm not going to get into lawsuits in this conversation. That is not my qualification. I actually don't like the fear-mongering aspect of the world of accessibility. So this is where I'm going to stay, and it's the only mention I'm going to have about that. But I do want to let you know that 7 in 10 disabled customers click away from websites they find difficult to use. This is called the click away pound report from a company called The Big Hack in the UK. They do a lot of research around disabilities and things like that as well. And they have something called the purple pound. That's what they call the accessibility dollars out there. And it refers to that digital habits of persons with disabilities. Because since we are creatures of habit, once we find something that works, it's really hard to move away from it. And this is especially true for persons with disabilities or who use assistive technology, because once something works, you don't want to go and try and explore all the other banks or shopping apps or things like that to purchase something because it works and you know how to use it. Luckily, I've never met anyone yet in my career who said, I don't care about people with disabilities when I ask them. But it is an institutional problem, right? It's the environment we work in. It's easy to let things slide because, If no one's complaining about it, if my boss doesn't know about it, if my lead isn't checking my work, maybe it's, I'll let this one slide. But the truth is, those may represent barriers for users, and that's a really big problem. On screen, I've got this treasure chest with a bit of gold inside because I want to remind everyone, like I said earlier, you will convert more sales if you make your site usable by as many people as possible, because it does benefit more than just your accessibility users. All right. I know we're here to talk about forms and web accessibility. I just definitely had to get that out of the way. So I don't know what your skill level is. I don't know if you're a newbie. I don't know if you host a React conference or something like that. And big caveat, I am not a pro React developer. In fact, I did a lot more Angular work back in the days. I don't know if that's a bad word around here, but that's the truth. But I do consult with a lot of companies on accessibility who do use React. And we work together to get through some of the problems. And I want to share some of those issues and solutions that I've come up with, and just kind of a broad idea around forms, because that's where my starting point usually is. I want to make things as usable and as functional as possible. So if I can get one thing through to you here today, it's that fraction of a second before you push your code, if you can just stop and think and say, oh yeah, accessibility. Let me just do this one thing here. To me, that's a win. And we'll talk about how React is accessibility and things like that. So to kind of get us started here, I want to ask, what is assistive technology? In fact, I'm so used to the interactive part of these types of conversations, I'm missing it right now. I will give a little bit of a hint. If you want to put in the chat, though, I'm sure I've got someone here who can relay it back to me, but that's all good. Assistive technology is screen readers. You may have heard of that before. It's a way that your computer can read out the content on the screen to you. It's also buttons on doors, right? That wasn't designed for us with 2 cups of coffee and a handbag to go through doors. That was designed for people with mobility issues. They're sip puff devices, which allow 2 inputs, a puff and a sip, or maybe other movement with the tongue or with your lips. That's an assistive technology. Joysticks and buttons and tablets attached to wheelchairs. Wheelchairs themselves are assistive technology as well. Pacemakers, canes. And you know what? You're not expected to know them all, but you can learn 1 or 2 of them. More on forms is that 38% of audits that come back that I've reviewed have issues with forms. Some companies now, what they're doing is they're auditing their websites, auditing their mobile apps to see what's not working for accessibility for them. And this is really important now, because when I go and review that, when someone calls me in to say, hey, Cam, can you come help us figure out what to do with this audit, or come speak to our developers, I'll say, yeah, let's look at that audit and bucket them first. And what I found is that the labels that are missing is a really big problem. Focus highlighting and error messages and form validation, these are all secondary, but really missing labels on things like buttons and inputs, this is a really, really big issue out there. If you could imagine using some kind of assistive technology, a screen reader perhaps, and all of a sudden it just says to you button. It doesn't actually describe what that button is, doesn't tell you what the function is. You don't know if it's going to be empty my shopping cart or buy now, right? How frustrating would that be? Keyboard only users can't interact or have a hard time interacting with things that are missing labels or focus highlighting problems. Screen reader users, like I mentioned, can't interact with them either. But even more importantly, voice control or voice command users, people who use tools like Dragon Natural Speak, who would just speak the label, if that's not properly associated on that form, well, then they're not even going to be able to enter data into that form element itself. And I have a theory as to what causes this, actually. It's that we, as developers, as technical folks, we tend to lack sometimes a plan before we get started, especially if we're freelance. We're not used to that rigorous idea of let me put something together. I know I do it because I'm a developer. I can say that too. We just jump right to it because sometimes it is faster to start mocking up directly into your code. You can just throw that in there and mock something up really, really quickly. Then all of a sudden, a couple months later, you realize that initial code, right, that was just supposed to be an MVP just to show a demo to a client or something like that, has all of a sudden become part of that core build. And you're then stuck rewriting components and elements, and you're just, it becomes a big spaghetti mess to try and fix. So I always say to everyone I talk to, try to have a plan before you put the code down, even if it's just on paper. On screen, I've got an image of my plan for this talk. It's just a really easy mind map, but it gets me thinking about what I have to worry about a few steps down the road. I've got a friend who says plan, 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 then execute. I mean, I'd maybe remove a few of those plans, but at least it gets me thinking. Now, maybe you can't every single time, but give it your best bet. On screen now, I've got a simple contact us form. Now, to those of us who wear many hats, and I know a lot of us wear many hats. I know dev designers, I know dev testers, I know of design testers, not too many. I also know of system architect, copywriters. Well, okay, not too many of those either. But what happens when we look at a form, and this is something as simple as a contact us form, right? What's wrong with this form? Well, what I see here is that there's big accessibility issues. So on screen, I've got a contact us form with 6 areas to it. It's got name, how did you find us, comment, email, phone, and date of birth. Now you might be thinking, and I know I thought this when I saw this form as well, was what the heck is date of birth doing there? What does it have to do with this form at all? So when I start to think of my requirements, when my manager, my boss, my client comes to me and starts to say, let's build this, I'm empowered to question them, and I think you should too. And this is a big part of being a developer and starting to move into a more consulting role or into a more authority role, maybe a lead or something like that. If you can go and start to look at areas like this and say, you know what, we actually don't need date of birth on this contact us form, unless it's maybe, unless it's really required. So think about that. I would say the biggest problem with this form, other than the fact that it's, the color contrast is off and things like that, is it's actually just too complex. So the first thing I always say is that we should focus on simplification in everything we do more than anything else. What are the benefits here? Senior citizens who maybe aren't comfortable using technology like we are, who didn't grow up with technology. People whose English is a second language, adding more information when needed, right, as descriptors, but reducing the overall context of the form to make it easier to understand. What about kids? What if you sell a product like Neopets or something like that, where people under the age of 16 would want to sign up? Well, simplification is really going to help in that scenario. What about persons with cognitive disabilities? All of a sudden, that becomes a big issue. What about users who are partially blind, but who don't use a screen reader, who all of a sudden just blow up their screen? And if you've got form elements kind of a little bit everywhere, you're not meeting the needs of those clients. So I always say cut. First thing I like to do is, just like with my code too, you start to cut, refactor, reduce, shrink that form, shrink the amount of data and content that you have on there, and you will make everybody happier, including yourself, by the way, when you build it. So some of my thoughts around forms is that, I'll ask, what information do I really need? What does this form really do? How am I going to use the information on the back end? If there's any back end developers here, maybe you're using the, monitoring the database, how is that going to be there? Who is my target audience as well? Like, back when I said seniors and kids, usually you're not dealing with both of those audiences at the same time. How will I handle the information? Right? That also has to do with security as well. So some friends out there who are listening, information security is huge. How am I going to monitor that? Date of birth all of a sudden becomes a piece of private information as well. Do I really need a signature or a phone number or a date of birth? Or do I even need to gather the information around gender anymore? Is it really that important? So what questions come to your mind as you're creating that form page? Another one I thought of here after I created the slide was payments and Captchas. How do I secure all that information there, right? If I am using gender, am I also including persons who are non-binary, right? That's going to be important as well as we start to become a more inclusive society. And by the way, longer forms don't particularly get you more or better information. In fact, a lot of people just drop out of long forms as well. Getting people in the door to give you your email and contact info is usually the first step to anything. And the more you can reduce that, the less friction that you get, and you can still collect a lot of really, really good data. Someone in my industry by the name of Meryl Evans, and by the way, you should be following her on LinkedIn. She made a post a while back about text messages. I want to read that to you here. So on screen, I've got just a snapshot of the LinkedIn post itself. And she's mentioning that we need to change the process for forms to make them more inclusive. There's a field on online forms that frustrates a lot of deaf and hard of hearing folks. Do you know which one that is? It really is the phone number field. And it's often a required field. And I just read of another person's story about applying for jobs and needing to fill in that field. He said he doesn't have a phone number. He's already frustrated with the job hunting process, and this exacerbates it. And I'm going to admit, before seeing Meryl's post, I'd never thought of this before, because asking a phone number is kind of just standard, right? It's required, just put it in there, but we don't even know that we're excluding some users too. And if you need more proof, by the way, right? Gen Z just coming up and starting to buy things right now. Maybe I'm old. Maybe they've been buying things for a while. They almost never want to be contacted by phone. So having that option of preferred method of contact in association with the phone number is really going to benefit you. So here's the simplified contact us form, full name, and I've got a placeholder there that says enter your full name. How did you find us? Because that's good for tracking of where to put your sales dollars, where to put your advertising dollars, right? That's important to have there. A comment, and then an email with an example in there as well. So because I've read a lot of audits in the past, this is a really good example on what an ideal form looks like. So the lesson here is that do your due diligence and plan out just a little bit more before you even start the form, before you get everything built out. It's too easy just to execute and create something quickly. So on screen, I've got the code for the form I just built, but no one wants to watch me read that. It's like paint drying. I'm just going to skip ahead and talk a little bit more about the concepts instead. I want to talk a little bit about Semantic Html, because this is important to every single developer, React, Angular, or just plain vanilla JS. You need to take a second to think about Semantic HTML, because HTML is a specification, right? Some of the things just to go through here, your form fields, your checkboxes are all inputs, and they must have a type and label to them, because assistive technology can't be relied upon to fill in those gaps. So now with linting, a lot of that's given for free, but sometimes if we're just writing in VS Code, if we don't have linters, if we're just throwing something up in CodePen, if we're not adding those requirements, then people are not going to be able to interact with the form, with the elements, with our application, the way that we intend it to be. Dropdowns must have a label. Links, anchors must have an href on them, even if it's just the attribute itself, href, and without any kind of destination on there. Your buttons, you should be using buttons. I know in React, we love to use divs all over the place, but buttons are hugely important for keyboard-only users, because even if you put the on-click event on there, you're not always going to be able to interact with keyboard-only using a div with a type a role of button on there. Tables, really important about tables too. I'm going to talk about fragments in a moment. Tables should have captions, summaries, headers, and footers. Images, graphics need an alt text on them as well. And lists, which I'll also talk about with fragments, ULs, OLs, DLs, they should have as child elements only LIs. These are all things that we forget about because it renders properly on the browser. The browser wants to display our code however we want it to, be it on native or just in browser. It doesn't matter. The browser itself wants to render it. And we, as sighted users, as sighted developers, we look at it and say, oh, okay, that looks all right. Or let's just adjust this a little bit. But we don't really realize how broken it may be to users who don't use a mouse and a keyboard and can see the browser. Quick word on React fragments here. Don't forget to use them when you can, because your lists and your tables. So according to the HTML specifications, the only child element of an OL, ordered list, UL, unordered list, or a DL description list, the only child elements of those can be an LI or DL in the case of, a DT or a DD in case of the description lists. If you need to use a fragment, on screen I've got an image of a little sample code here. I snagged this right off the ReactJS accessibility page, which is fantastic, by the way. I still use it as reference as well when I need to. And see, they've got fragments, and that will remove the need to have a div around there as a wrapper, and it will allow you to adhere to semantic HTML. So other places I see these are in tables as well, where you can't have a div as a child element of a table element. So something to keep in mind. I want to show another example of a bad form here, just in case there's any designers who like to listen into these types of calls as well, or someone who is just curious about it. Or maybe you've even been given a design too. I empower developers and technical folks to collaborate and associate with the designers on their team, even if they're offshore or somewhere else in the world. Challenge those designers as well to tell them that, no, you need a label on every single element in your form. And now you may look at this form here, and I've got company name, email, password, phone number, and a check mark and a sign up for free. Now these aren't labels. You may know them already as placeholders, but the problem is if you start to enter data inside a placeholder field, you now no longer have any context as to what's supposed to go in there. This is actually very common also in sign-up forms, right? Or login forms. Sometimes you don't remember if you have like a username or an email address to put in as the user, and then password, of course, is usually hidden or obfuscated anyways. So this can all of a sudden get really concerning for a lot of users. I would have to delete the data in these fields to be able to understand what's supposed to go in here. That's unacceptable. And by the way, this is actually a very large company who I snagged this form from. I didn't grab this one as an example. I didn't build it myself. There's a whole bunch of other problems with this form too. There's no focus styles around each of the elements. So when I tab through, I'm not able to see visually where my focus is, which is a big problem for keyboard-only users. And I also there's no labels. There's missing a focus outline. And oh right, the checkbox, the I agree to terms and service and privacy policy, doesn't work with spacebar either. So a couple of big accessibility issues on this. Kind of surprised for a company this size. I won't say what it is though. So I'm going to be showing kind of the things that I think of every single time I look at forms. And some of these are going to be specific to React. Some of them are not. But in all forms, I need to make sure to label each control. I need to make sure that's keyboard operational. I should be able to tab through in a logical order every single form element. I need to make sure my visual cues are there. The focus indicator, usually I like to say it's like a 2-pixel dotted line is usually pretty good around all focusable elements. That's pretty good. And make sure that they're in a logical order as well. Make sure I indicate any mandatory fields that are there, not just use the required attribute in HTML, but also indicate it visually using a star or the text required on the label itself. Also make sure, like I said earlier, use semantic HTML. On most forms, if I need them, I want to make sure those group-related controls are all around. And this is especially important for those of us who are using component libraries that are not using native components, such as checkboxes. Sometimes we're styling it in a different way. Grouping those controls together using the appropriate semantic HTML is vitally important. There's something called the Y aria, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, that'll help you out with that if you need it. Make sure that any kind of input validation is done, and apply useful placeholders as well. Even if your design team, your content team, raise it with them, or maybe yourself, just add it into there because placeholders do help users hint as to what they're supposed to put in there. And finally, some forms, again, if you need it, notify users whenever errors crop up. That's hugely important. Offer stages if you can, if it's a very long form. This is really important to apply pages to that too, so that users can save or take a break if they need to, apply timeouts. Accept any data. You should allow the front end to handle data gracefully. Here in Canada, we have 3 characters and then a space, then 3 characters again for our postal code, A1A, 1A1. Now, I still see it today where they require the space between the first 3 and the last 3 characters to fit some type of database schema. that is so easily handled by regular expression. Now, I know that's a bad word, and a lot of people they don't like saying regular expression. There's a lot of other ways of handling it as well, but allow the data, allow the system to handle that data gracefully is really important as well. And indicate time, how long it is to complete long forms. I think this is a really good idea as well. All right. Since we are talking about a single page application, most often with React, I got to talk about focus management because it's just too important to not mention. What happens in a single page application when you click on a submit or when you go to the next page, the focus goes anywhere it wants. What happens, it usually falls back on the body element or something like that. And a screen reader user or a user with assistive technology doesn't know where they are on the screen anymore. They have to start from the very top and go down to the bottom. So this is also something to think about in your designs or in the way that you think of your form. I see a question here, Fabian. I just want to let you know that I do have some tools at the end of this presentation that I'll be walking people through to show how you can test out your application as well. So I've thought of that too. We'll talk about that in a moment. So back to focus management, especially when we talk about screen reader users, that focus will just fall onto any element itself. So you should think about handling that using the component did mount method, and you can handle and apply focus on a variety of elements. It could be the first input of a form, or most preferably, it should just be on the main element of your application. If you don't have a main element, I know sometimes we're working backwards and forwards and backwards. Try to put it on the H1 on the page. That's also a very acceptable place to put the focus. On screen, I've got just a couple of screenshots there. I've got a React form with a sign-up sheet. And once you enter all that data in and you hit submit form, the React form says, thank you. So that's a perfect example. My focus would have been on that submit form button. As soon as I submit, what happens to the focus? It just disappears. So I would manually either put it on the thank you or the React form, depends how you're going to handle it in your backend. Next up is focus indicators themselves, still in that idea of focus. So I've given two examples here. I've got two screenshots of what focus indicators can look like. You can use the native focus indicators that are on browsers now, but this is another opportunity, especially if you want to go and talk to your designers, your brand managers, things like that. They can use this as, once again, another place to put branding, such as your color schemes and things like that. Who do focus indicators benefit? Well, everyone, power users. I don't know the last time I was filling out a form and I didn't use my mouse to click on different elements, but man, don't we see it often where you're tabbing through a form and the focus just goes off somewhere and you don't know where it is, or maybe that focus outline is missing. So this is a key element to any kind of development. Make sure you put that focus on there. Don't put outline 0 into your CSS. So who does it benefit again? Keyboard only users, partially sighted users, and power users are definitely the top 3. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about colors once again. There is something called the contrast ratio. I'm not going to get in too much into color theory, but it's good enough to know that normal text needs to have a 4.5 to 1 ratio, and large text or UI elements such as buttons or inputs, drop-down menus, they only need to be at 3 to 1. I'm going to give an example here in a moment, but for simplicity in this conversation, let's just talk about the 4.5 to 1 because it's harder to achieve. This is the perceived luminance between two colors. And that important word there is perceived, because this is, human perception translated into computer speak. So yeah, take that how you will. On the left, I've got an image that says good. It's on a yellow background, I believe. It's 19.6, so it's very easy to read. On the right-hand side, I've got a bad and it's called a magenta background. I'm colorblind, I'm not sure. It's only 2 to 1, it's hard to read. And you don't have to be colorblind to see this is hard to read. So sometimes branding colors can kind of get mixed up there. And this is also very important too, if ever you're creating for printed media and social media. I know a lot of developers now are building some very neat things like certificates as well. You can build a custom certificate online that matters too, in case someone ever wants to print it out or put it up on LinkedIn or something like that too. On screen, I've got a really great tool called the Color Contrast Analyzer, and that's British or Canadian spelling of color, but CCA will do. If you just put in CCA accessibility into Google, you'll find this. And this is just a free open source tool out there where you can use an eyedropper to click on 2 different colors, and it will tell you what the contrast ratio is between those 2 colors. Right in the middle, I've got this. It says that color contrast ratio of 2:1, which is not sufficient. But if you want to go one step further, I use a tool called the Accessible Color Palette Builder. And I love this tool. This is such a great tool. You can actually just add your color palette to the tool itself, and it will create a grid that you can print out or create into a PDF, what have you. And you can just send this to your PO, your PM, your designer, what have you, and they will know which colors they can work with for accessibility. Not sure if I can do this. I'm going to try and share this. No, I can't interact with the stream. That's okay. I'm going to pop that in there and see in the private chat if maybe that's it. All the links here will be available in the show notes. Not a problem. All right, there's a question about testing a little bit earlier, and I'm going to talk about 2 different types of testing. One is a tool-based, but good thing to know is that you don't even need tools to test a lot of your accessible applications. So I tend not to talk about the web content accessibility guidelines too much. I've got a slide in a couple of moments here to talk about it, but it is not a checklist. And I want to highlight that if anyone says, well, you just go through the WCAG and try to figure out accessibility from there, you're not going to work very efficiently, because the most important behavior that I can change on you, and if you don't remember anything else from this entire, you don't need any plugins to do this. You don't need any browser tools. You don't need to install anything. I know some security at large organizations is quite restrictive. They don't want you to install plugins or other tools or things like that. You can just do one thing. Okay, before you push your code or as you're building it, if you can just do one thing, tab and enter. Just tab and enter. You build a little form, you build a button, you build something interactive. Tab and enter will tell you if your focus states are correct, if your interaction is correct, if your order is correct. If you lose focus anywhere, it's going to tell you exactly there, and you'll be able to fix it right on the spot. So just make that part of your flow. You build your code, you test it, and then you can push it to Git or the repository that you're using. All right. As of right now, I mentioned there are 78 Web Content Accessibility Guideline 2.1 success criteria. So I like to say is don't get stuck on them. Like I said before, many times in this presentation already, don't get stuck or hung up on success criteria. On screen, I've got an image of 3 people pushing a car stuck in the snow. It's, I'm sure this is in Canada because, man, we got snow yesterday. It's nuts up here. But you don't need to memorize them. And you could say that you could use any tool to go through it, but don't get stuck on these success criteria. Because if you only focus on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, you're really going to miss something around usability, because they're not rules. They are just guidelines. So as the name itself implies, on screen I've got a mock-up of a mobile app or something like that. So it's got the navigation on the bottom. Well, there's even a trade-off here that happens, because the guidelines say that you should have a logical focus. On a mobile device, the focus outline for users is for Android devices is called TalkBack. For iPhone users, it's called VoiceOver. The focus would be at the top and then would skip down to the bottom in a logical order. Well, there's a trade-off there, because what about young users? What about users with mobility issues? What about users who have small hands, who have dwarfism? They really do benefit from having buttons at the bottom. And yeah, so do I as well. No one likes to reach up to the top left to hit that close button. It's really convenient to have everything at the bottom, right where your thumb is. So documentation is key in this scenario. And I would encourage anyone, after you start to review and revise that mile-long accessibility backlog that you have, start to document your process around there and bucket them in certain areas and document the process of why you did that. It's really, really going to help. So like I said, navigation at the bottom, it benefits users with smaller hands. So the disadvantages are sighted users who do use screeners, it'll break that logical focus. I like to think of it much better in usability in terms of personas and usability instead of those success criteria. On screen, I've got just an image of a bunch of Lego heads. I like this image. It's just super fun. But if you think of personas, I'm not going to go too much into personas today. You'll start to think of, as a user who uses a keyboard only, I want to be able to submit this form, transfer money in my bank account, purchase this object, something like that. And that will start to really align the way that you develop with the way that's intended to be used. I had a comment earlier about a tool that you can use to audit for accessibility. All browsers currently have some kind of tool embedded in them. That's okay. It's an okay tool. I much prefer to use the Accessibility Insights for Web by Microsoft. I'm not promoting Microsoft here. It just happens that they've got really great accessibility tools. Accessibility Insights for Web. Just go find it on Google. It's in the Chrome Web Store. It's everywhere. And you can download it. My favorite piece of that tool is that it actually can show you your focus states and the order that that falls into as well. Really big benefits. So as you can see here on this form, it was built a little bit strangely. It starts off with number 8 at the top, then it jumps down to 9, and up again to 10, up to 11, up to 13. I don't even know where 12 went. It's all over the place. Poorly built form, but this will show you really easily where your focus states are, and it'll help you track that too. So you can also try out a screener called NVDA for Windows. I'm not gonna be able to give a demo today for that. Wish I could, but there's lots of demos online. NVDA is the name of that tool. Again, in the show notes or in the comments right now, you can find it. Other things to consider while you're looking at forms are Captchas. There's a huge intersection right now between security, information security, and accessibility. Captchas on the left, where you have to identify an object, like select all images of a bus. Well, what if you can't see? What if you have sight issues? You're going to have a really hard time identifying what a bus is, right? It's much better to use the reCAPTCHA by Google, which identifies your browsing history and bookmarks and stuff like that. Excuse me, not bookmarks, cookies, to figure out if you're a real person or a bot. That's a much better way of handling it. Please do not use the puzzle piece CAPTCHA if you've got one, because a keyboard-only user, a screener user will have no idea how to interact with this. And once again, you've lost a customer and maybe even potentially opened yourself up for lawsuit. Required fields, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's no clear consensus on how to handle required fields accessibly. So just pick one, it's okay. You can either put a star or explicitly say required. At a minimum, you should and absolutely must put the required HTML attribute on any form element that needs that is required, because that'll communicate back to assistive technology users that they need to fill in this element. So of course, there's that scenario where I can hear you already saying, but Cam, my client absolutely positively does not want to see visible labels. Just so you know as well, React does fully support ARIA attributes. So ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And these are attributes that hook into your browser or your user agent that a screen reader or other assistive technology can read. So I've just got a simple example here of ARIA label. You may have come across this before. It is an invisible label that only assistive technology users, primarily screen reader users, can interact with or hear. So there's some benefits to these. It'll still read out company name, email, passwords, and phone number, even if data is already inside there, but that doesn't help the sighted users, right? So when I showed you that slide a little bit earlier with the pyramid, with that good, better, best, we can, it's okay. We can meet the guidelines here with our ARIA attributes. We shouldn't rely on them. We should be trying to move towards the better or the best. But if it's a stopgap, if you just need to get something out the door, you can leverage ARIA whenever you need to. ARIA, there's a whole section on that online, way too long for me to go into in just one simple conversation. But look up WAI, ARIA, why ARIA for more information on that. One last one here. I just want to talk about a few more things on forms, buttons with no text. So the Nielsen Norman Group, who are world leaders in research-based user experience, they do a lot of really neat stuff. What I like is that they really do talk about their information on their website. They've got a whole section here on buttons with no text. So us as sighted users, we know that the magnifying glass means search. Well, it's funny. I talked to some people who no longer recognize what that little diskette looks like, right? Anyone who remembers floppy disks remembers what a diskette looks like. And that's the save icon. But who knows, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, we truly won't know what that diskette is anymore, but it still represents save. Well, you should still label that button. That's hugely important to still label. Apply a label on there. You can use that ARIA label technique, which I showed earlier. That will work the same way on those elements, on those buttons with no visible label. All right. As a quick recap here, don't design cockpits for nobody. Allows users to consume how they prefer and allow your system, your web application, anything to be adaptable to how they want it. Plan your form, plan your tool before you actually start building it. It's too easy as developers just to start jumping in to, let's just build it right away. And if you're building a new form or using a plugin or something like that to build it, just try to remember labels, instructions, validation required, and placeholders. I will have that screen up in a moment for you to take a screenshot of if you'd like. But I just want to give a quick shout out here to Reach UI, by the way. If you are looking for React-based design system or tools or things like that that really, really work well in accessibility, look at Reach UI. They've got great documentation on there. I refer lots of clients to use this because it just works so well for accessibility. Highly, highly recommended. So finally, this is that forms checklist one more time. I'm going to leave it up on screen here for a moment. If you want to take a screenshot of it, as a marketing student would probably say I should put my logo on this slide, just in case you got to take a screenshot of it. But hey, maybe that's for next one. Take a screenshot of this. This is a really good checklist. If you have to think about forms and you're building something, this is great no matter what. And finally, I just want to leave with one quick mention here that the DEI space, the inclusion, the accessibility space is really hard. It's actually broken me a few times. I know other accessibility professionals, it's broken them because you push and you push and you push and you try and talk to leaders and you try and talk to the developers. You try to talk to your team or designers about accessibility and they just won't listen. They say they don't care. That's tough. That's tough when you go to your boss. It's tough when you go to your client and say, maybe we should think about accessibility here. Maybe we should consider it. Maybe I should read a little bit more on accessibility and try and consider taking a few steps, just tab and enter right before you push your code. Well, I've been speaking on accessibility since 2014 now, and I got to tell you, every single year, more and more organizations than ever before are talking about accessibility. And I'm talking to them with less resistance than ever before as well. So change is happening. Change is happening right now. So if you're not on board, if the company that you're speaking with isn't on board, there's something going on there and they're going to miss the boat. I'm not threatening with lawsuits or anything like that, but they're going to miss the boat. And more companies than ever before are making their web applications, their mobile applications and everything fully accessible for all users. And with that, my name is Cam Beaudoin. On screen, I've got an image of myself and a little snapshot of my just the search bar in LinkedIn. I post daily accessibility tips. I'm talking a lot about the business of accessibility nowadays, less so on the development, more so just on how do you get business involved in accessibility. Don't be shy. If you have a question about accessibility, if you want to know how to approach accessibility, or if your team needs help, reach out on LinkedIn. I'm super approachable. What you see is what you get. We'll have a laugh together, and I'm more than happy to take a moment and talk to you about accessibility. And with that, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Cam, that was amazing. Here, let me, Nick and Fabian, if you guys want to jump on real quick. I will say, I don't know if others feel this way, but someone who doesn't have an issue with accessibility, it's very easy for us to forget that there are so many people out there in the world that do need this help. So sitting in on something like this is I think a reminder and a wake up call to the rest of us. One of my directors actually is colorblind, and there's times where we will put something together and he's like, I can't see it. And
right.
we're not realizing that. So, and that's just on the colorblind part. That has nothing to do with somebody trying to fill out a form online. So I really appreciate everything that you presented today. It's a good reminder. If anybody has any questions, this is the time to add that to the chat. I know that you gave the link for, was it toolness.github.io for the color matrix. And I know that you had also mentioned a tester that could be used for people to test. Is there anything out there as far as like, not just to test, but just to kind of guide someone through coding appropriately to add those items into a form? Or does that tester give those examples?
I've got two answers for you there. Number one is ESLint is great. I think we're all pretty familiar with ESLint, and that will start to pick up accessibility issues now. You can set it up and configure it to do that. So that's number one. Make sure you got a linter on there that will pick that up. Number two is that, yes, that accessibility tool, Accessibility Insights for Web, does have a step-by-step kind of walkthrough feature as well with it. So that by the time, if you're just checking your own application, something like that, you can just turn that on. It'll tell you, check this, do this, look at that. You don't need to be an expert on testing anymore, and you don't need to make that your full-time job to just put check marks in a box and say, does this application have a video element? No. Okay, that's a pass. You can move right by that. I think it's got 50 checks or something like that, and it allows you to really take that in a logical step-by-step manner. So I'd say that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Fabian, Nick, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, actually, can you not hear me? I put my headphones.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So two things, actually three things. First thing, awesome presentation, Cam. Like, I can't tell you how much I took away from what you talked about today, and I learned so much. So I'm actually we're very fortunate to have you come present on accessibility. Yeah. The other two things, I forgot what slide it was. I believe you talked about screen readers, and I was like, in my reaction turning, I was like, oh my God. Like, I was like, to me, the way that I consume information best is actually text to speech. My computer, anytime I'm like on Medium, all right, like I'm able, I wish I would have known this back in high school or middle school, where it's just like, if I have a text reader, I can just listen to something at 2x speed, 3x speed, whatever. I understand what I'm reading, versus if I'm like reading it, I can't ever read anything in a noisy area. Like I can't focus. I can never consume it. So like, it's just, and to your point, it drives me crazy when I can't select text on a website.
Yeah.
Or whenever I download a PDF, and a PDF is an image that
right. That's a perfect example.
And worst of all, it's like 64 pages, and it's like, there's no way I'm going to read 64 pages. So, but so that was the second point. The last point, and this is from my own at work. I've been learning more and more about accessibility. I knew that obviously it's a thing, but when it comes to React testing, or it should be just testing in general, I've learned that you make your life so much easier if your application is accessible. So obviously, like, React testing libraries are very big. It's right up the new hotness in React. And I've learned that, hey, if we actually make our forms and our buttons more accessible, it makes our testing library or our testing code that much easier to write. And so that was just one thing I wanted to note. I believe that you mentioned, I'm pretty sure you mentioned it in your presentation, but one thing that I wanted for others to also be aware of is, like, if you're testing your application, whether it's end-to-end or unit testing, if your application is accessible, you're going to make your life a lot easier writing that test. I guarantee you.
Yeah, for sure. I know a lot of clients who do that as well, help sometimes build some of those test cases too. And yeah, hooking it into those ARIA attributes. Yeah, I think you put in there, you didn't know that ARIA meant accessible rich internet applications. So that's it. Yeah.
All right. What about Nick? Any questions?
Yes. No, I just want to say like what Cam kind of said at the end about, you know, I always say jump on the wave now just because I know the last two companies I did work on right before we were leaving like the platform and changing to another platform, they wanted to focus on accessibility, and we did have those sites audited, and unfortunately those two sites did not do too well. So I know when they were going to the rebuilding process of it, that they were going to try to focus more on it as well. So I know, like in my world at least, in my experience, like it's coming. It's becoming almost like a standard where it's just like just get it done, and they'll definitely help out a lot of people and make your site better as well. And yeah, so no, thank you so much for the great presentation. I feel like I got introduced to like a whole nother world. I didn't know it went like that deep. No, we only kind of touched the surface of, accessibility. And no, thank you for touching on the topic.
Yeah, you bring up a really good fact around Facebook did a study, I think recently, where 80% of users now are watching videos without sound on, right? It could be because it's late at night watching a video. I mean, this applies to all social media, right? It's just not just everyone's watching TikTok at like when you can't sleep. It's because you can't sleep. You're watching TikTok and can't sleep because you're watching TikTok. So, but you're watching it with no sound on, and it sure is a good thing you got those captions on there too, right? And that was initially started off with, let's help people who are deaf. But all of a sudden, TikTok now has native integration if you speak English on your TikToks, and it'll put captions on there automatically. So I have friends who are deaf who've said the past 2 years actually since the pandemic, when really Zoom and a lot of the other conferencing tools got on board with automatic captioning and transcriptions. When they started getting on board, everyone started getting on board, and all of a sudden, the web became a much more fun place to be. Watching videos all of a sudden became a much more pleasurable experience for everyone. And now I know it's happened to all of us. Like, you're scrolling when you're on the bus and you're like, I'm not going to watch that video because it doesn't have captions. I'm just going to scroll right on by. So that's something that we like. It's just happening now. So caption your videos. I don't talk about that not very often, but caption your videos.
Yeah, I can't imagine Netflix without captions.
Right,
right.
right.
It's like Game of Thrones is probably what like opened my eyes. Was like it's English, but I don't understand it, and like so I just at that point moving forward, everything is captions, and it just was like
Blinders for me. That was the one that got me, and I'm like, nope. After Peaky Blinders, captions were on all the time.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, thank you again, Cam. We really appreciate it. It was a much needed topic for sure. And I think with that, we are good. We would love to have you back at any time if there's another aspect of web that we all need to be enlightened on. But with that, yeah, you guys have a good night and see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone.